Welcome back to the James for Justice podcast, where we talk about all things related to criminal justice, including the criminal court system, prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys, police officers, probation officers, corrections officers, and criminal justice reform. Today, I want to talk about something that's been in the news for quite a while over the last year or so, maybe 2 years. And that is police officers dealing with crisis intervention, especially when there's someone who has some kind of mental illness. And I want to say this right at the beginning. First of all, this conversation is separate from my legal practice, so nothing here constitutes legal advice or counsel. This is just educational and informative. But I also want to say that I think there has to be a greater willingness by interested parties who are talking about justice reform, police reform, to try to find the middle ground somewhere. Because I think what's been happening so much over the last 2 years is this great sort of polarization where on the one hand, we have people who want to defund the police and basically eliminate law enforcement from our streets. We can see now in certain cities out west where there has been a major defund the police effort, and it's been successful in so far as there's been a lot less funds for police and there's been a lot less police officers. It's been unsuccessful in that we see crime rampant in most of the cities where defund the police has really taken root. So I don't think that's the answer either. And so I think a huge problem we have in society right now that we have to grapple with for everyone who's interested in any kind of justice reform, whether it's reforming police, whether it's reforming the criminal court system, whether it's reforming even the civil court system. We have to start looking at the extremes and filtering through some of the strenuous or large emotions or the sort of major emotional components of particular policies or policy efforts, in order to look at what's good about that particular policy idea and filter through maybe some of the past trauma that an individual or group has experienced to arrive at something that can be logical, rationally applied, appropriate, and address a multitude of factors, not just one particular issue. I think a challenge we have in society right now, you can see this if you read the news or listen to the news on the radio for about 30 seconds, is that we've become increasingly polarized as a people. And I mean primarily in the United States, but I think this is happening throughout the world as well, in part because of social media. When an extreme position gets attention, on some level, we think that's good because in social media, we want attention. So people who want attention take extreme views. In order to get news or something that's newsworthy, it typically has to be pretty extreme. An extreme position will get attention. And yet, is that really the best way for us to think about and rationally analyze two potential solutions in criminal justice reform when, again, emotions seem to drive a lot of extreme or what could be considered extreme positions, whereas we have to filter through that to get to the logic and the rational basis for certain policy ideas before implementing them when they may have far-reaching consequences that create bigger problems than the initial solution was meant to solve. Let's not let the solution become a bigger problem, in other words. So I I want to talk about this whole question of mental health and how police officers address this by talking about a piece that I read recently about a Detroit man, Porter Burks, who apparently had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Police didn't know this when they came upon the scene. There were multiple police officers, at least 5 or so officers, were trying to handle a situation where apparently he had a small, I think, 3.5-inch knife. The blade was 3.5 inches. Police were trying to use de-escalation techniques, trying to talk to him, talk him down, calm him down. Apparently, he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to go with whatever their plan was for him, and he refused to put down his knife. At some point, he makes some movement towards the officers. It can be described as a lunge, or some might take it as an attack. Others might look at it as he's just sort of losing control. And if he's, in fact, having some kind of schizophrenic, psychotic break with reality, and I mean that with respect, but medically speaking, if he is not connected to reality and may not be understanding what the officers are doing or saying or what they're attempting to do with him, then we have a whole different situation. And I think that's where, when ultimately he makes this movement towards the police, according to the report, there's 5 officers that fire off 38 rounds toward him in 3 seconds or so. 38 rounds of ammunition in 3 seconds by 5 police officers and 1 gentleman who's got a small blade knife. When we look at this situation, I think on the one hand, it's really important not to Monday morning quarterback and judge police officers because they use lethal force in situations where they felt it was justified. But on the other hand, I think we do have to try to look at these scenarios from the standpoint of the individual who was shot and killed. This report just came out a week or 2 ago, so I don't think there's been any findings yet, but it is one of those scenarios where we have to look at these situations keeping in mind the humanity of everybody involved, not just the individual who was shot. Yes, we should certainly keep him in mind because his life was taken. Whether it was justified or not, that's a legal analysis, but it's also a human analysis that we have to look at as a society when it comes to what is happening out there in the streets when police officers use lethal force. Because at the end of the day, lethal force is something you cannot change. You can't take back. You can't give life back to the person who just lost it when lethal force is used. And while I certainly appreciate the fact that police officers have a difficult job, as a criminal defense attorney, I respect police officers, but I also have to deal with hundreds of cases where people's rights, in many of those, not all, but in many of those cases have been violated. Constitutional rights have been violated by police. Personal legal rights have also been violated in different scenarios. There could be a big difference in terms of whether it matters to the outcome of a particular case, whether it's a legal right or a constitutional right. But either way, we're talking about people's rights. And I think the questions that are risen whenever there is a police shooting, but especially when there's a police shooting involving someone with a diagnosed mental health problem, that is a serious one, like schizophrenia, we have to get back to questioning what else can be done to better train police officers, to have a level head, to be mindful, to be more aware of their surroundings, to keep their response proportionate to the threat. And again, I recognize it's easier to look at this from the outside, But at the same time, all of us have situations where we have to analyze how to give a proportionate response. And those of us who don't give a proportionate response can end up in legal trouble ourselves. So for example, getting into an argument, you're having some drinks with friends at the bar, you're talking, and all of a sudden the guy next to you says something that annoys you. You ask him to shut up. He doesn't want to shut up. He gets louder. You get louder. It escalates into something where ultimately you decide you're going to give him a quick elbow in order to get him to shut down, to shut up. He doesn't. He ends up pushing you. And then next thing you know, you're on the ground rolling with each other and there's a fight. Okay, the question about how to stop that before it gets to a point of escalation and physical confrontation really is one of the key questions. And I think it's the same kind of question with police officers. When their training, for some reason, is falling short in terms of equipping them for the challenges of society today, and there are lots and lots of challenges. I don't say that police officers have an easy job. I don't think on any level that they're going out with malice or with particular attitude to gun down people. But whatever kind of training police officers are getting, by and large, is not enough to help officers keep a cool head, to be mindful, to be aware, and to judge a particular threat appropriately in order to respond with an appropriate level of force. And that, again, gets back to some of the case law, Graham versus Connor, other cases where the U.S. Supreme Court has said reasonable force can be used in either arresting or seizing or detaining someone who's violating the law, but it has to be proportionate in response to whatever the amount of physical force or resistance or threat actually is. And maybe it's, we've come far in terms of, I think, seeing officers use less physical hand-to-hand force. Whereas back in the day, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, there would be more use of physical force to get control, to make a point, to keep people from escalating their own criminal conduct. So if it was a quick grab to the shoulder by an officer who's dealing with some punk kid like I was when I was 16, screwing around, that can make more of a point than arresting someone and charging them with a crime that then they go through the whole legal system and possibly end up with a criminal record. And yet, in our society today, any amount of physical contact can be seen as assaultive or aggressive or malicious, when I don't think it necessarily is. At one point in my career, I worked with a retired police sergeant who became an attorney, a very skilled criminal defense attorney, handled many high-profile cases together with him. And he would share stories about how things were done back in the day, so to speak. Back in the 70s, the 80s, not so much in the 90s or into the new millennium. I think with the rise of video recording, cell phones that record video, there's been a major decrease in the amount of physical force, and I don't mean lethal force, but physical force by police. And I question whether that's always a good thing for police officers to do their job, because there are times where if an officer feels hamstrung between using no force at all and can only use verbal communication to try to de-escalate, try to calm a situation down, but the person on the other end of that conversation, let's call it the subject, whether that person has a mental health problem or not, is typically unknown. And a lot of people using drugs or who are drunk drinking alcohol can seem like they might have what looks like mental health symptoms. So it's hard to tell when you're an officer. I'm sure it's hard to determine whether that person has a diagnosed mental health condition or not. All you know is that that person is not following your directions, is not calming down, is not willing to go with the program that an officer or multiple officers on a crisis intervention team are trying to accomplish. And so I think there is a part of me that thinks that police officers need to have a little more liberty to interact physically with subjects without fear of reprisal or being terminated or sued, while at the same time training officers to use that level of physical interaction more cautiously or more mindfully. And when someone is more attuned to physical interactions as opposed to just verbal, and can feel more composed in the midst of an interaction that turns physical. If somebody grabs my arm, it doesn't mean I need to pull out a gun and shoot the person. It doesn't mean there's a threat of lethal force. And under the law, it's only a threat of lethal force that justifies a police officer in using lethal force. And so I really feel badly for officers who in many ways are hogtied or hamstrung, are caught between two ends where they're told only to use verbal commands and verbal de-escalation, while at the same time that doesn't get the job done. And it's almost as though in an officer's mind, when they're dealing with some situation that escalates, that's outside of their control with escalation, but they need to try to maintain or get control in order to bring a subject under arrest, to make a safe situation. It's almost as though the only tools that officers seem to be using these days are their tasers or their sidearm. And neither one of those creates a best case scenario. Tasers are less lethal, but there are lots of stories where they've become lethal if somebody's, I think there was a case, young guy was on a four-wheeler driving down the road and an officer tased him and ended up crashing the four-wheeler and dying. I think there has to be some ability for police officers to use their hands and arms and their own person in a way that is non-threatening, but that can bring subjects under control without only feeling like they can use a taser or a firearm to bring someone under control only when there is some perceived lethal threat. And I think the continuum of threats from passive, non-threatening, all the way to active, very threatening, is this continuum that police officers are trained on. But in practice, going from a situation where if you don't have much hand-to-hand work or training, if you don't have the background in something like wrestling or some sort of martial arts, jiu-jitsu, where you become accustomed to being attacked in a competitive sense, right? Somebody puts their arms around you and wants to take control and bring you down to the ground, or they might be on top of you and you have to try to find a way to get on top of them and regain control. If you don't have that kind of training, then your mind can quickly and easily see some physical attack or some physical movement or approach from somebody else who you don't know, who you perceive as a threat, can easily see that as more of a lethal threat than it really is. And I think then it's harder for our minds to judge that actual threat versus the perceived threat. And that's where Scientists talk about this all the time with the amygdala, that part of our brain that is really the key part of our brain for survival, is tuned into survival. But it's not tuned into rational thinking and analyzing a situation to see the variables that might be important in deciding whether to run away or fight. So the amygdala is responsible for the fight or flight or freeze terminology, the way that our brain, this is not really even our thinking brain, it's our instinctual, biological, survival brain. It's a part of our whole brain, but it's a small part of our brain that is responsible for survival. And we've all experienced this. If I remember as a kid, be sneaking around outside with my friends after hours. We weren't supposed to be out, but we snuck out of our house to go do who knows what. And we're walking around. It's pitch black. It's dark. We're really, just kind of exploring the night. It's probably 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden, I remember hearing a dog probably 15 feet away from us. Hard to see it because it was a black dog. I think it was a Rottweiler. And as soon as we heard the dog bark, we took off. Our brains instinctually told us, flee, run away, get away. We could hear the chain of the dog as it started to run towards us. And I don't know, but I think the chain stopped it. We didn't wait around to see what was going to happen. And I've never run so fast in my life. That's the fight or flight mechanism at work. And it helped protect me from that situation where I didn't even have to think about it. I just took off, as did my friends. And we got to safety. But what we can do to better modulate our amygdala is to take time to become more comfortable in uncomfortable situations, whether that's with some kind of martial art like jiu-jitsu or boxing or wrestling or even lifting and working out and really pushing yourself. Even when you don't want to do another rep, you do another rep or you do another 2 reps. You get beyond the point of your normal comfort zone physically, and you train your brain to be more comfortable with that. When you can do that, then you find yourself being more calm and more at peace in situations of confrontation. And being able to better sort of rationally analyze a situation that feels threatening instead of just reacting, fight or flight or freeze. You can analyze the situation quickly, assess a threat better when your mind is more comfortable with a particular threatening situation or a very uncomfortable situation. And the more we as a people can do that, but especially police officers can do that, the more capable they will be at analyzing the threat and responding proportionally. So that in situations like this case with Porter Burks, who had schizophrenia, was suffering from schizophrenia, and had a small pocket knife on him, I believe that police officers could have better assessed that threat to recognize it was not fatal or potentially fatal to them. That, yes, while it's a knife and it is a lethal instrument, the size of it and the number of police officers supporting each other really minimized the level of threat. And when an officer has greater ability to assess the threat and can determine that less force is actually needed in this particular situation than I would have otherwise thought if I hadn't gotten more comfortable with being uncomfortable, if I hadn't trained my mind and my body, trained my brain to remain calm and mindful in the midst of a threatening situation, then I can do much better as a police officer. And I think that's where I think we have to start looking at how to better train not only physical traits of police officers, but mental traits, so that it's not just book learning. It's learning through the physical experience of something that's uncomfortable, so you get used to it. And when I started training in jiu-jitsu, just as one example, it was very uncomfortable when somebody was on top of me, basically had me submitted, and as much as I didn't want to tap out because of pain, I was struggling just to breathe, just to keep my head, my mind calm, my brain mindful, because I felt like I really, not that I was going to die, but that I was really uncomfortable and I wasn't used to it until I started doing it more, till I started to understand that I can actually sit here with some 250-pound guy on top of me. We're wrestling, essentially, training jiu-jitsu, and I can feel uncomfortable while not being done completely. So even if I'm breathing heavily, I need to try to restore normal, calm breathing and keep my mind clear so that I can decide what move I can use to change the submission and actually gain control. I think if police officers and police departments could begin to make this a greater part of police training, where the mind and body are learning together, not just the mind in a 4 or 8 hour course once a year, but the body is physically training, and that trains the brain as well to remain mindful and calm in a situation, so that a police officer can use proportionate force only when needed, can use less force as often as possible. And I think that would be the greatest service to police officers, because police officers are putting their lives on the line. And yet I think with a lack of training in this physical, mental model of training, police officers will react. And often, as we saw in this case with Porter Burks, react disproportionately to the situation. And what does that mean? It means a life was lost, but it also means police officers suspended, probably terminated, possibly even charged with crimes like manslaughter in this particular case, because there were 38 rounds fired at a 20-year-old who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. For the sake of our officers, we don't want them to be in situations where they use lethal force without being mindful of other options. And I think better training is critical to protect the lives and futures of our police officers who we need out there, who we need to protect our communities, but also to protect those who are innocent, to protect those who may have mental health diagnoses, to protect those who might just be struggling and need a firm hand but not a lethal hand to deal with and calm down a particular situation. So let's really try to support our officers, but also look at new ways to rethink police officer training so that less force can be used, less lethal force can be used, lives can be saved, and we can help create a better, more humane criminal justice system. So let's think about that. Let's keep fighting for criminal justice reform. Let's keep fighting for the lives of everybody who's involved in the criminal justice system, not just one over the other, but everybody. So together, this system that is supposed to help us have a more organized and orderly society, when on the fringes there may be issues, people struggling, people having difficult times, doing bad things, we can better restrain ourselves and keep things in the middle. And I think we can do that if we start to look at better ways to train police officers, not defund the police, not remove police officers from the streets, but to support them, provide better training and support so they feel more confident in their jobs and more capable of using other methods besides lethal force, like happened in this case with Porter Burks. So my heart goes out to his family. I also want to support everybody in the criminal justice system, including police officers. So I hope some of these thoughts get to somebody's ear. And if you like this, please like the video, subscribe if you want to get more like this. Follow me, share this video with others if you think it could be helpful. Together, let's keep fighting for criminal justice reform.